Thank you for the warm welcome, and thank you for being here. It's been such a pleasure being here in Porto, and I can see a few familiar faces who were a part of the workshop. Thank you once again for coming. I really appreciate it. I think we really did a fantastic project, no? I thought last night the conversation was so dynamic. So I'm going to get right into it because this talk itself, the structure, is rather long. What I'm going to do is I will plow right through it, and there's going to be a point I already know is going to get quite boring. And when that point comes, I'm just going to click for images and speed up. So these are the 5 things I will talk about today. The name of this talk is 5 Recent Lessons. These are 5 recent, deeper understandings of who we are and where we are. We're thinking about our relationship with history and theory, our relationship with color and materiality, our relationship with structures and organization, our friends and influences, and finally doing some good, quote unquote, because I think this is something that means a lot to everyone, what good means. So the symbol of our office, this symbol on your left is the queen piece in chess. It reminds us simultaneously that the pawn piece is the weakest in the game. But if you keep going, don't die, and reach the other end of the board, there's always a possibility that you become the strongest piece in the game. And the symbol on your right is a heart instead of a diamond from the playing game, the card game. This is also a second reminder to ourselves. First reminder is don't give up and don't die. Second reminder is even when times are difficult and when you feel that the world makes you want to be jaded, don't forget to be kind to people. So right now it's me and Joanna. Although I started this project, I think it's so super impactful to be able to work alongside Joanna Grant. And I think, independently we do different projects, but sometimes we do projects together. These are 2 independent projects. Sometimes we design objects also. And I think this is a perfect office portrait. The one on your left is titled Scribble. And the one on the right is called Snuggle. And we developed it independently without talking to each other about the title, yet it turned out very similar, Scribble and Snuggle. And they both explore different qualities of the curve. One is hard, blue, brittle, and lights up at night, which is a perfect description of, I guess, who I am. And the other one possesses every quality of Joanna. And at the beginning of Bureau Spectacular, this is, I guess this would be one beginning around 2008. Right at the beginning of the, let's say, the last financial crisis. I was by myself at the time, and I was teaching in Chicago, and I happened to have come across this warehouse in Chicago. They were renting it for 80 cents. Per square foot, which is, I don't know how to translate that for a square meter, but it's really inexpensive. It's super, super cheap. So I moved in and decided to build a house instead of a warehouse. And so this was my house before, the briefcase house, something that's too small to be architecture, but too large to be furniture. I was living here by myself, and this was the beginning of the office, Bureau Spectacular. This is where we would have been about a year ago. We've since moved out of this huge space and moved back into a very modest environment. But to summarize, what we've done in the last, about 10 years, we've done a bunch of small-scale installations. For example, an installation that rotates at once an hour, challenging the notion of gravity and gravity's relationship with orthographic projections. Can a plan and a section and a reflected ceiling plan really be the same drawing depending on its relationship with time? As we rotate this installation at once an hour, every 15 minutes, one of the surfaces would become parallel with the ground, in other words, plan. And every 7.5 minutes, we would experience what Claude Parent and Paul Virilio may have been talking about when they talked about the principles of the oblique. But if, other installations that we did early on included, other rotational diagrams. If the project that I showed previously is a rotation around a axis, in other words, a cylinder, we were also playing around with ideas of the sphere. So here, tumbling around object that is an abstracted spherical or dual tetrahedron object. And as it tumbles around, its shape and its relationship to the ground would give it new proportions and new characters. So these were some of the installations that we were doing, but at my core, I just drew a lot of comics in the first few years. And some of the comics, like this one, Sociopaths, would explore the relationship between architecture and the unreliable narrator. If someone incorrectly remembered plans or sections, what happens to a crime scene? I'll get into this one in a bit. Or, along the way, if I liked comic books and I cared about publication series, of course I would pursue something like this, and this I'll also get into in a bit. But, at the core, I would say the early career of Toyo Ito is very, very meaningful to me. The first 8 years of Toyo Ito's career, he had a small office called Urban Robots, or short for Urbots, which Fala and I had a conversation about last night, incidentally. And, Urbots was a project where Ito's focused primarily on not building architecture, not necessarily building. There was only one building that was done. It was this one, the house for his sister. But primarily for the first 8 years, it was maybe a formulation of a voice, a formulation of a consistent voice that has been worked through and thought through. And how does one do this? For Ito, it was a lot of teaching, writing, publication, at the end of it, a lot of research and experimentation. And perhaps the circumstances of the environment circa 2008 forced my hand to start that way. But it was really helpful in the first 8 years to really work on some of the experiments. And I'm happy to report that today we're getting more projects, including some commissions. Some things are being built. And, but I do want to use this opportunity to summarize who we are. So I would summarize it by describing 3 primary points of our career. I would say step 1 or stage 1 was cartoons about architecture, where cartoon is the medium and architecture is the subject matter. Stage 2 would have been cartoonish architecture, where architecture is the medium and cartoon is the sensibility. And so sometimes it would be played out in plans or in sections. And currently what we're pursuing, I would call cartoons on architecture. If the day-to-day life is sometimes very cinematic, and the cinematic sensations are very much like storyboards, it is the backdrop or architecture that dictates the mood of such a scene. And if we were to extend the thought process that the storyboard is like a cartoon, perhaps what we want to do now is construct cartoons on architecture, providing a stage for humans to play out their scenes. But on a smaller level, I think once we start thinking about cartoons on architecture, I then can't stop looking for cartoons on architecture, including these 2 super iconic Florentine doors, the poor souls from either the Bible or Greek mythology are forever trapped, playing out one scene in what in fact are really nice cartoon bubbles. And the stories are very literal in these cases, but maybe in other cases, they're just bubbles. And they're just bubbles with abstracted stories, and humans are just in the foreground. So that's an introduction. Now I will get into talking about the first point, which is our relationship with history and theory, and I will do a talk about posture, quote unquote. So in the 2017 Chicago Biennial, we were in this room. Actually, Fala was also in this room. And we were asked by the curator, Johnston Mark Lee, to talk about an image. So the prompt was to produce a model from an image. And the image that we chose eventually was Loz's Muller House, realized in Prague in 1930. There are two primary reasons we chose this image. One is voyeurism. The other is the essay, Principle of Cladding. The idea of voyeurism, we took this as an opportunity to consider the status of architecture as a machine for voyeurism. We wanted to find a way to further elaborate upon our reading of Beatrice Colomina's reading of Loz's work and spend some time on this architectural diagram. To say that architecture could be a machine for voyeurism is also to say that there is a spectator-spectacle relationship between the multiple players inside of a continuous interior. If we consider architecture as a stage that builds characters, there are players that play their parts, and there will be the viewers that become the audience. A further reading of the Muller House allowed us to see a clear division between two parts of the same house. One side of the house that views, another side of the house that performs. The Great Hall, where something like a living room, looks back at the other four programs: a kitchen, an entryway, a children's room, and a ladies' boudoir. In other words, the gaze of the living room is in control of the other four characters: the kitchen, or a servant, the entryway corridor, or a stranger, the children, and the ladies in the boudoir. This is a story about the construction of power within architecture. The voyeur is not only an audience, but a person in control of the other four characters in the house through the act of seeing. In 2013, I wrote a story titled Sociopaths. It is a short graphic novel about a murder case. 3 witnesses, all suspects. The wife in this murder mystery tells a story about jealousy, lust, and revenge. She describes a silent dinner party, an attempted love affair, the act of spying, and a physical altercation between the two men. In the story, she takes a bust sculpted in the likeness of the eventual murder victim and drops it on his head from the mezzanine. As the victim nears his final seconds of his life, his gaze haunts her. She could not tell in his final moments whether he was gawking at her or at himself. Because we also saw the flip side of voyeurism as an act of narcissism. In our model, we installed one-way mirrors for the other 4 characters on the opposite side who are being watched from the living room. This is a one-way mirror that prevents the awareness of the spectacle from gaining the knowledge that they are being watched. The powerlessness of the spectacles are deepened when we install buttons on either end of the podium that the model sits on. From the living room side, the act of turning on or off the lighting meant whether the other 4 portals are revealed. Yet, we installed 4 buttons that cannot function from the side of the servant, the visitor, the children, and the ladies. We created a built-in false hope system so that any self-help is functionally functionless. The second reason for choosing the Muller House is the Principles of Cladding, an essay from Adolf Loos. The Principle of Cladding was written in 1898. In it, Loos talks about the status of a livable material. The carpet, or an animal hide, is a livable material. Loos argued that the act of covering oneself with an animal hide was the first architectural detail. This idea was something that I worked on in 2011 through another story titled Primitives. Through the story, I was able to work through ideas about skinning, quilting, cladding, all acts about the covering of oneself under an animal hide. The reduction of detail of the human emotion or the human expression meant the making of a mystery. The absence of a human face meant a self unable to convey one's own exact meaning, relying only on the abstracted body language to communicate. So even if I were to cover one's face, here are three super iconic studies of the human body, a Greek kouros, or bilaterally symmetrical human youth. This is Michelangelo's David, a human youth performing contrapposto, meaning the shoulder line, the hip line are not parallel with each other. And here you have Bernini's David, a youth performing a mid-motion torque. Even without their faces, one could read that we have a stiff, relaxed, and intense individual. So for me to go through such great length and think about the idea of architecture as character, or maybe the human body as a skyline, is to say that the skyline could be read as a sentence. What if the skyline is a sentence, and every time we read a sentence, we understand that the abstraction of the architecture is such a great source of societal identity that people would, wear this graphic on their shirts or drink it out of their mugs. And maybe one of the functions of architecture is to participate in the making of these sentences. If the individual characters are written by the architect to create such a source of identity, maybe that is part of what we do. And this is partially why architecture as character is something that we deeply care about. It was around a time I used the primitive stories to consider the possibility that maybe I can construct an installation such as the White Elephant to think about the tumbling around and the making of architectural massing as personalities. And we were also thinking about Lena Losa's bedroom and its relationship with, the fact that the Mueller house is growing a 5 o'clock shadow. And we decided to cover the entire model with a livable material. In conclusion, our project titled Another Braun Plan helped us continue our work on two ongoing lines of thought: architecture as character, or cladding, as well as architecture that stages character, the spectacles as spectators. Okay, so that was part one of 5 lessons that we learned recently. So next I want to talk about conversations about color and materiality. Before I moved to before I moved to Los Angeles, this would have been a very representative type of work that we did, in that we're always thinking about rainbows and unicorns and clouds. And if you were to explode a bunch of rainbows, maybe you can sit on it, and it'll be as soft as clouds. But this happened to me. This happened to me when I moved to Los Angeles. Almost on day one of moving to Los Angeles in 2014, I happened upon this work of art by Vincent Lamoureux titled Bates Hotel. This project really spoke to me about something, which is stucco is white, concrete is white. In Los Angeles, steel is white, wood is white, even nature is white. And it kind of forced me to be thinking a bit more about all the people I admire or care about who's been through Los Angeles or are in Los Angeles. And it's almost shocking, without exception, almost everyone, even in the less likely cases or in the least likely cases, they have, a moment of total whiteness. And I started tracing the train of thought of the word white, or maybe the etymology of the word white, possibly relating to its, or let's say blankness or blank, or maybe is it related to neutrality or nothingness, or possibly authenticity or modesty, And along that train of thought, I started thinking, what are some of the ways that other cultures may be expressing similar trains of thoughts? And possibly in Japan, it's the residue of wood, maybe. Or maybe in Northern Europe, it's the presence of brick. To a point where, I guess, for MVRDV, even if the materiality itself dissolves and stops being brick, it still has to be brick. So back to Los Angeles, this is one of my favorite things to think about when I think about Los Angeles. This is the LA River and the LA River bank. Those of you who's been to Los Angeles may have seen this as you're driving by Los Angeles, the LA River. So the bank of LA River used to be a favorite playground for graffiti artists. When you think about graffiti, let's discuss the likelihood that graffiti is a political act. A gangster, or let's say a member of some gang, may be tagging in order to declare the presence of a gang. In other words, it's a drawing of some lines, of some certain political boundaries. And when you think about the idea of rock art, as ancient as, let's say, 40, 50,000 years ago, the declaration of a presence of a self or declaration of a presence of a territory is the very function of graffiti. And we can perhaps consider graffiti today to be an extension of rock art that we still perform 40,000 years later, just like our ancestors. So the political entity that is Los Angeles made a decision at one point to perform an act of mass censorship and blank out every voice that's declaring a self. In such an act of mass censorship, to me, Los Angeles declared a few things. One, like any country or political flag, the color here is white. Number two, to Los Angeles, the act of erasure declares that white is as good as concrete. So my conclusion, I can only arrive at one conclusion, which is in the city of Los Angeles, white is not a color. White is a material. And not only that, white is a pliable political material. So I started thinking more and more about, my tendencies of liking certain works of art and whether or not they're related to white or whiteness or blankness or nothingness, and maybe even taking a look back at work that we've done in the office and how is it that it's so consistent we participated in this pattern. And I want to tie it all the way back to this project, Tower of Told Stories, something that we did for Coachella Music Festival. So this was our final site visit before the project was about to be finished. And I was so mesmerized by this image, I was thinking to myself, man, this is so beautiful. I really wish that we don't have to clad it or paint it white. But something about Los Angeles whispered to my ears, almost like a suicide note. I could not resist such feelings of compelling my work towards such whiteness. And maybe white is such a powerful political material in the city of Los Angeles. So sometimes, I would have gotten journalistic interviews about this project, and someone would ask me, "What's this made of?" My earnest self would say steel and lumber, but not my snarky self at times would want to tell them it's made of white. This project is made of white. Because, in our past, we didn't always do white. There were times that I would admire the patterns of plywood and I would leave it. But even similar projects, this is a retail store that we did in Los Angeles in 2016. Even our retail projects based on the same diagram became white. But maybe there is a step beyond that we're working through, which is white's reception to adjacent colors. I mean, this is a very deliberate projection, I know, but there are times that the projections are not so deliberate, and they also allow us to be thinking about different hues that the material white receives, and it's beginning to influence how we think about our management of color and our management of materiality. Okay, so this is step 3 or lesson 3, fitness, or structures and organization. In 2015, we were invited by curator Aaron Betsky to participate in the 2015 Shenzhen Biennial. Aaron Betsky had 2 requests only. Request 1, can you make a 3D collage? Request 2, can you be contextual to the fact that we're in Shenzhen? So I decided to try to fulfill both requests. And as a consequence, we went on a shopping spree. And we constructed a 12-point program towards shopping. Carlos, could you take a photo of this so you can send it to Moreno? I think he would appreciate 12 points of shopping. No, but I think, so in the 12 points of shopping, we really have only one question to the objects that we were looking for. And we would ask the question, or ask the object this question: "Dear object, are you homesick?" In that we look for objects that were made in China, and we were going to go to China, and so maybe we can stage a kind of class reunion for all the things that had been exported. And so we staged this kind of course, being fans of Stanley Kubrick, and being unable to afford expensive French furniture, we went to the dollar store and looked for qualities of objects that may be homesick. And so we shipped them to Shenzhen, and then after the exhibition was done, we mailed it back to Los Angeles, meaning all these guys have been back and forth the Pacific Ocean at least 4 times. But something that we discovered, I guess I can highlight in this frame right here, which is by scattering the objects at certain gaps and by placing scale figures between the objects, we discovered that perhaps we are obsessed with this loose fitting diagram. I'll come back to the loose fitting in a second, because at the Tower of 12 Stories project that we did at Coachella 2016, we didn't do a loose fitting project. We did an ill fitting project. Notice how ghastly these gaping holes are so poorly fitting, incredibly bad, just terrible. I would never have thought that, having been trained in a school of architecture, that I wouldn't know that when you place a compression on a tangent point that faces downwards, it's just really inefficient. And our engineer even told us so. I do want to kind of come back to this diagram. And, based on our obsession with architecture as character, I also wanted to construct something, a structure that is performing contrapposto. So I said, okay, hey, can we make hip lines and shoulder lines not parallel to each other? And not only that, can we figure out a way where 0 out of the 12 columns are perpendicular to the ground? So here you can see that 0 out of the 12 columns are upright, which is very stupid, no? And so as we developed it, we figured out really interesting ways of making it, not upright, but structurally really sound. So instead of thinking of them as columns, we thought of them as bundles, almost like tripods. And that way they really became quite strong. But then we were also able to, realize the qualities of ill-fitting, which is, should the day come that we get to build a building this size, it is almost for certain that I will consider the making of windows this way. And but maybe loose-fitting and ill-fitting aren't the only things we do, because there are times that we do a perfect fit, a well-fitting jigsaw puzzle. So the retail store that I showed earlier, this is the diagram of the retail store. We were thinking, yeah, let's fulfill all of the 9 typical, retail programs that we see, like fitting rooms, or display, or checkout, and what have you, and explode them out of a single staircase, because we were thinking that the staircase is such a friendly and social aspect of architecture. People sit on staircases to look at each other, and I'm effectively sitting in front of a staircase right now, in front of you guys. And so perhaps we can, and maybe even back when we were obsessed with rainbows and clouds, this was already part of our system. We're always thinking about how to make jigsaw puzzles. But back a little more on the topic of loose fitting, because at the 2014 Venice Biennale, when we did the Taiwan Pavilion, we did do a loose fitting project as we look back. If I am, as I've been, so obsessed with comic books, maybe the speech bubble or the frames that contain, comics or the content are as specific of a speech act as architectural program. and maybe ideas of, let's say, eating, sleeping, or so. If we exploded a domestic diagram into individual buildings, and every program is a house of sleep, a house of dining, a house of garden of sorts, it is now the gaps between these buildings that produce this kind of interior urbanism. But it is also a way of thinking, maybe in comic book technical term, maybe the gutters are activated so that the human can walk around, and maybe the outline of architecture itself is the outline of a physical paper space, a page. And once I start thinking about that, I can't unsee it, and I begin to also see cartoon plans everywhere, including one of my favorite plans, the Moriyama house. And this idea of flipping the cartoon on its side and thinking about the flexibilities and specificities isn't that exactly the way that we could talk about corridors and bathrooms and living rooms or so. And to a point where I even was able to reflect back upon architects I didn't really fully understand when I was younger, such as Stan Allen's Korean American Museum. Such elegant moves of simply rotating certain squares that are loose-fitting, like a confetti, and finding the gaps between them for expansive and contractive qualities in plan and in section. So the idea of fitness, loose-fitting, ill-fitting, and well-fitting, I have to say, is maybe all I think about these days. And this is a story about structures and organization. And for a person who started out drawing nonsense comic books, I think it's a good place to be, because now I'm thinking structures and organization, such idea of hierarchies and overlaps and superimpositions, is not necessarily just an architectural problem, it's a mathematical problem. And it's a mathematical problem to a point where we can consider logic of sets and logic of parts. And I had this going as a trailer, and so we do think about the Boolean problem much the same way as a problem of the set theory. Okay, this is part 4 of 5. This is the part that gets a little boring, so I'm gonna skip through as quickly as I can. In 2015, we did do this project. It's a publication exhibition project with the Grand Foundation, Treatise. I invited a number of people to be a part of this publication series, including Fake Industries and Norman Kelly. And we were super fortunate to be able to stage such an event. This at the time was a record-breaking, because how institutions keep their clickers. This was a record-breaking event at the time, and we were also the youngest participants at the time, but now we're old. It was so. Why did we do this? I guess here's Konstantinos and Mariana. This is Sarah Herda. In case you don't know Sarah Herda or the Grand Foundation, if you're interested in a life of research and experimentation, I highly recommend looking into the Grand Foundation. Their job is to give money to people so people can write, publish, produce films, exhibit, and so on and so forth. It's a very competitive program, but the fact that they exist is I think, a beacon of hope for all of the world, to be honest. And Sarah takes on this job. I think I can give an entire lecture on Sarah. I highly encourage all of you to look into it. But there were some sources of motivations to do the Treatise project, including the Charlottesville tapes, which was a gathering. I mean, here you can kind of hardly make out people's faces because, number one, this is low res, and number two, they were so young. This is Frank Gehry. Here you have Stanley Tigerman. This dorky Asian person is Toyo Ito. Rem Koolhaas had hair. And they were locked up in a room for about 3 days in Charlottesville. And they were forced to confront each other, friends or enemies, including, and the whole thing was transcribed, including here, Leon Creer ironically clapping for an entire paragraph. But, I'm also thinking about this as a commentary to the contemporary publication culture. I would say, no matter how much I love and respect the contemporary publication culture, it is a culture of compilation. Or in other words, it is a culture of mixtapes. Because there was a time of a culture of albums, meaning people would put together one thing in devotion for one idea. And I sorely missed that, and I decided to submit a grant to the Grant Foundation on this topic, and specifically thinking about the pamphlet architecture, which was a project invented by Stephen Hall when he was young and had no job or money. Just talking to Fala earlier too, I think when it comes down to it, it is trust. Architecture, it's in terms of getting hired, I guess. There's a thing with trust. If somebody had upwards of 6 to 7 figures to blow on an investment, with the expectation of that investment increasing, taking that amount of money to a fresh face is quite difficult, I think. But taking that amount of money to someone who's, let's say, looking fairly old is maybe a safer bet. So I totally understand why younger architects have a harder time, especially if they have a fresher face. But for Stephen Hall, when his face was fresh, he did this. He decided to apply himself and exert his energy in order to work out his ideas at the beginning. So, luckily, we were able to put this on 14 albums. And, as somewhat of an acting editor, I got to understand a lot of my colleagues, and I got to understand why, in a way, I got to understand myself a lot. Why am I gravitated towards these people as friends? What is it about them? Are they interesting at all? And maybe through looking at them, I got a better understanding of my own obsessions. And there are people that I obviously couldn't include, and maybe I was even thinking maybe there was an entire category that I wasn't thinking about, because maybe there are people who used music or art or sculpture or history as their instruments, but there are people who entirely use architecture as their instrument, and maybe that in itself was a category that I wasn't thinking about. So we did have this kind of moment, and I have to also report that from within the United States, there are other young Americans who are thinking about these kinds of problems, and they do put on these kinds of gatherings. But I want to pause here for a second and talk about friends and influences, and perhaps even a generational gap and generational divide. It's always been my dream to be a living architect and being in conversation with living philosophers who might be onto something. There's an obscure Dutch group that I recently came across, and we've established contact. And it's one of those, once you're on Skype, you feel like you've been friends for 20 years type of feeling. And they're talking about their relationship with postmodernism. Their relationship with, people who were born in the late 90s or throughout the 80s even, have this, and maybe for some who are just maybe late bloomers, were quite immature, like even people from the early 70s, have had this relationship with pop culture. If you sort of your multiple coming of age stories were surrounded by stuff like Simpsons or Seinfeld or South Park, there might be an inescapable situation where you just sound really ironic without trying to be ironic. It's almost like a sneeze or a reflex. The thing about it is that let's really dive deep into what it means to be ironic, because irony is a very serious thing. To be truly a postmodernist is to deploy irony as a rhetorical device. And such a rhetorical device is to perform a speech act that is contrary to its true meaning, to make a point. Therefore, meaning such a speech act is inherently, possibly insincere. But The types of irony that I'm witnessing around me today, including myself, is that I'll say stuff that just sounds really ironic, but I'm being very sincere about the subject matter. And you know, once I began to read a bit more about what they're talking about, I'm happy to report that I guess in about 2 months we're finally going to be able to do a symposium, and hopefully there will be more to come. Because I think without knowing about those guys, you know, once I look back at all these people, every one of them sound just stupidly ironic and untrustworthy, but all of their projects are trying to do something meaningful. And also through this process of understanding the relationship between irony and sincerity, I also came to terms with something else, which is why is it that I've only ever felt okay embracing what appears to be high art or high culture when in the back of my mind I'm always thinking about pop culture, where maybe I just should not resist anymore and consider the embracement of both to be perfectly acceptable. And maybe there are times that I'm only thinking about quote-unquote high art. And maybe there are other times that, you know, alongside Hiroshi Hara, I'm thinking about Kong Fury, but alongside Andreas Gursky, I'm thinking about Akira. And maybe that's why our sensibility is this way. And if you look through the ICE core samples of every archaeology, of course, what everyone was reading would be history to the people who discovered them. Okay, this is the last part, doing quote-unquote good. So we haven't built a lot. We've built a lot of temporary things, and some of the temporary things obviously have to face the consequence of being destroyed. Since we put this on Craigslist, I don't know, maybe you guys are not familiar with the format of Craigslist. This is something you put on the internet hoping someone would buy stuff. We cheaply proposed $150 for a really beautiful installation. This was, I tell you, this thing was inside the Disney concert hall. We were able to have a dialogue with Frank Gehry's project, and this thing was sitting above at Roucher. This was at the Red Cat Gala in 2017, and no one would buy it for $150. And you know, like. And the same year in 2020, well, actually the year before, in 2016, after Coachella, after the Tower of Tolstoy had to be taken down, this was the plight. You know, about 7 of the pieces were preserved by one of our friends who just loved the project, but the rest of it faced destruction. And so while I was watching this happen, I just, you know, I had my fist in my mouth. I was thinking, God, you know, is this what we do? We just, like, this lumber right here probably came from Brazil, probably, you know, had its, like, innocent life, just sheltering some endangered species, and there I am just being some, like, stupid hipster asshole, you know, like, stripping these endangered species of their rights to live because Coachella is fun. And I was so stricken with both guilt and anger that, you know, and also thinking about the way that even angrier with architects who find ways to look like they're doing sustainable architecture, because at this scale, I'm not doing that much worse than some other architects. I was so upset about it, I went vegan for a while. As you can tell, I'm not vegan anymore. But, so when we were approached by MoMA PS1 to propose another, you know, temporary structure for the warm-up series, their summer warm-up series, it came to our attention that Marcel Duchamp might be the very first sustainable artist by fully practicing reuse, reduce, recycle. And we also thought to ourselves, you know, what we could have done for the Coachella project was, you know, if we like stupid, like cartoon bubbles, might as well just go to industry standard cartoon bubbles that are being built almost on a weekly, if not daily basis. So I'm going to play a video. Earlier, I was practicing with Mariana's. I will end with this video. Here, so I use this slide to explain to board members of MoMA that you don't even have to be human to fully appreciate being in the pool together. Okay, so we earlier practiced, because of how the audio works, I'm going to have to do a 3, 2, 1 on the mark, okay? So let's do 3, 2, 1, click. Okay, 3, 2, 1.
Summertime is a time of leisure. It is a time when we remember to forget, at least for 1 or 2 weekends, there should not be a single worry in the world. Any hard-working person should take some time off, partake in some casual day drinking, half listen to some outdoor concerts, and forget your worldly sadness. Welcome to Pool Party, where no athletic abilities are required, and our only desire is a safe haven for a poolside lazy summer afternoon. Pool Party is an archipelago of half-forgotten dreams, like the clouds that fly over our heads whilst we all dance together in and around the shape of the shadows they cast. Strap on, relax, and enjoy the pool party. Pool Party is virtually indestructible. Engineer Matthew Melnick from NAS Engineering helped us develop a structural system where we can create a lightweight framework safe for 5,000 drunk people. Pool Party creates a pleasant climatic environment with a network of cooling factors including shaped shadows that stencils the sun, as well as designed evaporative systems. Pool Party creates a striking visual environment where visitors can dance under a sky of upside-down bellies of pools. Pool Party will be relatively easy to build. There are only very few basic material components to manage: tools, water collection system, structural framework, and on-the-ground furniture pieces. First, there are 9 pools. We consider each pool to be characters with personalities. We have always liked pools at Bureau Spectacular. Our Coachella project, tower of 12 stories, was a collection of pools stacked vertically. But what if we won't have to spend extra material or waste more energy to construct the pools, but follow the tradition of Marcel Duchamp and find a flying fleet of oversized fountains? What if we can find some off-market, already defective pools that companies would have disposed but gather them together into a team of misfit heroes in an epic rescue mission? For instance, Dune Bug, Lil Bob, Lazy L, True L, or the Ottawa are all industry-standard pools we already identified. No new energy will be required to construct the pools, and no pools will go into the dumpsters afterwards. We have had our share of heartbreaks with throwing away art projects we love. The next component is the water collection system. We will acquire a small amount of irrigation pipes and connect it into a network that pulls, drains, and nozzles out water. We have been calculating the correct sun angle between 12 to 4 p.m. in this geographic region of the world, and hope to spray rainbows against our pools. The third important component is the structural grid. Our initial question was, what if there is a construction happening in or around New York, set October 2017? Our idea is to schedule it to install in a synchronized motion with a project partner so that another group of people can reuse our structure almost immediately after. The last component is the collection of furniture-like objects on the ground. There will be a shallow pool-like object drained daily, where people can sit around and chit-chat. This is a story about reuse, reduce and recycle. We want to construct a system where a reduced amount of energy will be required to build the shapes we would have wanted to build anyway, and no amount of curated material will go to waste. This is also a story about the culture in or around pools. A drought in the 20th century became the very foundation of skateboarding as a sport in California when a creative use the dry pool took place in Dogtown. One could perhaps argue that this event became the first human physical interaction with an elliptic paraboloid. In a non-athletic sense, the culture of the pool is also a romantic space for the puppy love rescue scene in The Sandlot, the jealous passive-aggressive horseplays in Mrs. Doubtfire, the outlandish extravagances in The Anchorman, the sense of infinite sadness in Less Than Zero, the full-blown eroticism in Wild Things, Showgirl, or Alpha Dog, or the flirtatious cocktail winks in any Bond movies. The blue glowing pool has been a prime setting for iconic moments of fantasy space, getting in trouble, falling in love, or coming of age. Visitors do not need to know or care about our love for Cedric Price, Kishore Kurokawa, John Hader, or Yona Friedman. pool party, casting a group of shadows that shield tired and overworked people from the hot summer sun. Sitting on a 60 by 60 feet bounding box and peaking at 30 feet in height, pool party is a very feasible canopy system visible far away from PS1. For 18 years, the Young Architects program at MoMA PS1 has continuously been one of the most important platforms for architectural experimentation. Similar to the examination of an ice core sample, PS1 is a marker of air quality for every annual increment over the last 2 decades. Every single submission of the competition, built or unbuilt, is an evidence that documents the spirit of the times for every season. For that, we want to begin by saying thank you, MoMA PS1, for offering all of us a reason to reach higher.
Thank you very much.